Unit 5, Lesson 4, Major Battles of World War II. Unit 5, Lesson 4, Vocabulary. The battle in North Africa and the Battle of El Alamein, 1942. Allied forces are led by General Bernard Law Montgomery, Monty, while the Axis forces are led by German General Ernst Rommel, known as the Desert Fox. British had been fighting Germany and Italy since 1940 throughout Europe and North Africa. El Alamein in Egypt, and the battle was won by the British in October 1942. In November 1942, Allied troops land in Morocco and Algeria and begin to move east towards key German positions on the African continent. British were aided by Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton. Speaking of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a four-star United States general in the Army, he was a graduate of West Point, commanded the Allied invasion on North Africa in 1942. Later, he would be named the Supreme Allied Commander in charge of Allied forces for D-Day in the Battle of Normandy. Like General Eisenhower, General George Patton was also a graduate of West Point Military Academy. He was a tank commander and commander of the 7th Army. News of his exploits spread throughout much of Europe. The Germans greatly feared General Patton and his ruthless strategies and unwillingness to bend, and they nicknamed him Old Blood and Guts. Another prominent figure in World War II on the Allied side was General Douglas MacArthur, another West Point graduate. He was the commanding general of troops in the Philippines in the South Pacific. He and his men were forced off of the Philippines in 1942, and he vowed that he shall return. In 1944, the Battle of Leyte Gulf, General MacArthur was quoted as saying he had returned to retake the Philippines for the Allies. As General Dwight D. Eisenhower was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe, General Douglas MacArthur was the supreme Allied commander in the South Pacific. The map on the right shows you the various battle dates of the Mediterranean campaign, which took place in the country of Italy and its expanded territory. In July 1943, British and American troops landed in Sicily, a southern island off the mainland mass of Italy. September 3rd, 1943, Italy surrendered and ended the rule of Benito Mussolini. Hitler had made Mussolini a leader of a puppet state in North Italy, where fighting continued all the way through 1945. Back in mainland Germany, starting in 1942, the British began dropping bombs on German cities in a tactic that was known as carpet bombing, dropping bombs to cover entire city blocks multiple times, multiple days in a row. This strategic bombing was trying mainly to destroy industrial and political centers to avoid war-making power for the German offensive. Of those fighters who took place were the Tuskegee Airmen, an African-American fighter group who they escorted the bombers and protected them from enemy fire. This helped pave the way for an Allied offensive, crippling Germany's ability to counter the attacks. Here's a map of the D-Day invasion, June 6th, 1944, on the beaches of Normandy, France. The Battle of Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, was the largest military invasion in world history, all aimed at defeating Hitler. Over 5,000 vessels formed an armada which stretched as far as the eye could see, transporting over 150,000 men and nearly 30,000 vehicles across the English Channel onto the French beaches. 6 paratroopers or parachute regiments, totaling over 13,000 men, were flown from 9 British airfields in over 800 planes. More than 300 of those planes dropped 13,000 bombs over coastal Normandy immediately in advance of the invasion to soften up the German defensive positions. War planners had projected that 5,000 tons of gasoline would be needed just for the first 20 days after the initial assault. By nightfall on June 6, more than 9,000 Allied soldiers were dead or wounded, but more than 100,000 had made it ashore, securing French coastal villages along the beachhead. Within weeks, supplies were being unloaded at Utah and Omaha beachheads at the rate of over 20,000 tons per day. Landing craft devices, or LCDs, typically carried 36 men. They were called Higgins boats and were built by an individual who made boats to run on the bayou back in America and Louisiana. 20,000 Higgins boats were made for the D-Day invasion. To get through the barbed wire placed by the Germans along the beachhead, soldiers had to blast through with 10-foot pipes filled with TNT. Initially, 2 portable harbors were built and transported across the English Channel and set up on one of the British beaches and one with the Americans on the American beaches. In order to get valuable fuel from England to France, an underwater pipeline was laid which connected with the portable harbors to get fuel from England to France to help the Allied cause. To fool the Germans to believing the invasion was at Calais, the Allies dropped dummy parachute soldiers to the beachhead, confusing the Germans and allowing them to operate June 6, 1944, with strategic precision and surprise. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, chosen by the Big Three, that would be Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, and President Roosevelt, at the Tehran Conference on November 28, 1943, as a Supreme Allied Commander, and was ultimately responsible for giving the order to proceed with Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy, the D-Day invasion. American soldiers on a Higgins boat in the English Channel. American soldiers leaving a Higgins boat in the English Channel at the beaches of Normandy. A sampling of what one of the beaches looked like in Normandy, France, on D-Day, June 6, 1944. And compare and contrast that with a view of Normandy Beach today, October 2022. Battle of the Bulge between December 16, 1944 and January 28, 1945. Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes Forest in Belgium turned out to be Hitler's last offensive. During the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes Forest, Hitler and his troops caught the Allies by surprise and created a giant bulge in their front line and captured several key towns along the front. After about a month of fighting on December 23, 1944, the Allies pushed Germany out of France for good. The Battle of the Bulge hurt Hitler because he had to use reserve troops, and it hurt the morale of his men and their numbers. It became evident that the loss at the Battle of the Bulge shortened the time Hitler had left. VE Day, or Victory in Europe. In April 1945, Benito Mussolini tried to flee to Switzerland, but was caught by Italian citizens and executed for his crimes against humanity. Understanding that his German army was defeated along nearly every front, he was outmanned, outmaneuvered, and outgunned, April, April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler commits suicide along with several of his associates and top military officials. Only a week later, May 7th, 1945, Germany officially surrenders, claiming victory in Europe, VE Day. Harry Truman was a president at the time who had taken over for the recently departed President Roosevelt. Within the span of 3 weeks in 1945, the spring of 1945, President Roosevelt dies at his facility in Warm Springs, Georgia. Benito Mussolini is captured and executed by his own people on April 28th. And Adolf Hitler, realizing that Berlin was about to fall, married his long-established mistress, Eva Braun, and both committed suicide on April 30th, 1945. And with regards to the battle in the Pacific and General Douglas MacArthur, there were numerous turning point battles in America's island hopping throughout the South Pacific. In 1942, battles at the Coral Sea, Battle of Midway, where the battle at Midway virtually destroyed the Japanese Navy. Allies' advancements in the South Pacific precipitated a change in the Japanese strategy. Now, Japanese leaders were rattled by these raids and at the numerous bombings and carpet bombings from American and British and Allied soldiers might have killed the emperor. The American fleet, they decided, had to be destroyed. They wanted to cut off their supply lines, the American supply lines to Australia. They decided to attack Midway Island, the last American base west of Pearl Harbor. As the Japanese army was preparing for an assault, codebreakers of the American and Allied advancements heard the plan and were able to prepare. At the Battle of Coral Sea, the Yorktown, an American vessel, and the Lexington fended off a Japanese attack on New Guinea and preserved the continent and country of Australia. Codebreakers then learned of a plan to attack Midway. United States Admiral Nimitz used this as an opportunity to ambush the Japanese fleet. Japanese planes were hit with anti-aircraft fire, shooting down 38 planes. In all, Japan lost 100 pilots, which hurt their air war. The American planes caught the Japanese carriers by surprise. Their fuel, bombs, and aircraft were exposed. All in all, throughout the South Pacific and at the Battle of Midway specifically, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, destroying the heart of the Japanese Navy. This immediately halted Japanese expansion in the Pacific. Speaking of the Pacific, island hopping was a term where the United States would go on assault from island to island to island like a child hopscotches on the playground or like skipping a rock or a pebble across a body of water or a lake. Island hopping allowed America to capture some Japanese-controlled islands while ignoring others in a steady strategic path to Japan. It was a slow and steady process to get to Japan, but in the end it was reliable and effective in ending their conquering power. During the last 2 years of the war, the Japanese army resorted to suicidal bombers or kamikaze bombers to destroy the American Navy. During this time, approximately 2,800 kamikaze attackers sunk 34 Navy ships, damaged 368 others, and killed almost 5,000 sailors and wounded almost 5,000. The Allies' effort kept them advancing in the South Pacific, moving towards Japan. At the Battle of Iwo Jima in March 1945, it lasted for 36 days of hard fighting. The Americans eventually won for the Allied advance, but sustained over 23,000 casualties. Later the next month, April 1945, the Battle of Okinawa. This was the most costly operation in the Pacific. Okinawa held a vital airbase that was crucial to the Allied advancement towards Japan and ending World War II. Throughout, there were 50,000 casualties and 500,000 troops and over 1,200 warships involved in the Battle of Okinawa. Using these islands, using these places, American troops could strategically bomb the Japanese islands and prepared for their advancement and planned attack on Japan itself. In March 1945, one night, B-52 bombers destroyed 16 square miles of Tokyo, killing 83,000 Japanese and injured more than 100,000 more than the atomic bombs.